They already had the shovel out. That's the part I never told anybody, not for years. Before that filly had drawn what you could rightly call a full breath, before her legs had figured out which way was down, three grown men were standing in the rain with a shovel, deciding where the soft ground was. Not because they were cruel, because they were kind, in the way men get kind when they've buried enough animals to know that hopping too hard just makes the burying worse. She was the size of a wet dog. She came in the wrong week, in the wrong hour, in the worst water this county had seen since before I was born. The river came up 11 feet in a night. It took fences, took the Hadley's barn clean off its footing, took a truck, took two of my best mares and a colt I'd already half sold in my head. And in the middle of all that taking, this little scrap of a thing showed up, ribs like a hand splayed open. And every man on that ranch looked at her and looked at the water and thought the same thing without saying it. She won't make it to morning. I'm going to tell you how wrong we were. But I want you to sit with that first, with the shovel, with the men who loved animals standing in the dark planning her grave before she'd stood up once. Because the parts of this story that hurt, and the parts that heal, they don't mean anything unless you understand that nobody in this was a villain. We were just tired people who'd learned the wrong lesson from all the things we'd already lost. Her name came later. Everything came later. That night she didn't have a name, she had about a 2% chance and a river coming for all of us. Stay with me, this one stays with you. The water woke me before the dog did, which tells you something, because that dog woke for a leaf turning wrong. It was a sound I'd only heard twice in 51 years, and both times it had cost me. Not rain. Rain you sleep through out here. Rain is just the roof doing its job. This was underneath the rain, a low, grinding, patient sound like the ground itself was clearing its throat. River sound. Wrong river sound. The caney doesn't talk unless it's about to do something. I was in my boots before I was properly awake. That's a thing your body learns and your mind never catches up to. Marion was already at the window with the kerosene lamp, and I remember her face in that light, orange and still, and she didn't say anything dramatic. She just said, "It's in the low pasture already, Roy." I looked past her and there it was. Not a river anymore. A field of moving black with the moon broke up all across it, and my fence line, good cedar posts I'd set myself 2 springs back, going under a section at a time like somebody was pulling them down from below. This was June of 1975. I'd owned that land 22 years. I want you to understand I knew that ground the way you know the inside of your own mouth with your tongue. I knew where it drained and where it held and where a calf would get stuck in April. And I stood at that window and I did not recognize a single thing I was looking at. The water had rewritten it. We had maybe 11 horses that mattered and a scatter of cattle and one old mule named Pardon who I'd swear could smell weather 3 days out. And down in the near paddock, closest to the barn, we had Juniper. Juniper was a bay mare, 7 years old, heavy and foal, and about a week from her time by my count, which, as it turned out, was a week too generous. She was the reason I hadn't sold off into the drought the spring before. She threw good foals, straight-legged and sound, and the one she was carrying was already spoken for by a man named Delacroix over in the next county who paid on time and didn't haggle. In my head that foal was money. In my head that foal had a stall built and a buyer and a future. That's the kind of arithmetic a rancher does to fall asleep at night, and it's the kind of arithmetic a flood exists to tear up in front of you. I got my son out of bed. Thomas was 19 that summer, all elbows and certainty the way they are at 19, and there was a hired man staying in the bunk room, a quiet older fella named Cesar who'd worked 3 seasons with me and never once told me something that wasn't true, even when a lie would have been easier for both of us. The 3 of us went out into it. I'm not going to pretend to you it was brave. It wasn't a decision so much as a reflex. You've got living things down in rising water and you go, that's all. You go the way you'd pull your hand off a stove. The rain hit like handfuls of gravel. Cold, which is strange for June and coming sideways. Within 10 steps I couldn't have told you if I was soaked from the sky or the ground. There wasn't a dry inch of the world left to compare against. The lantern was near useless. The wind kept trying to take it and finally did later. But for a while Cesar cupped it against his chest like something newborn, and we made our way down toward the barn by its little failing light and by memory. The horses were screaming. I don't use that word loose. There's a normal upset a horse makes, and then there's a sound a horse makes when the water is at its knees and rising, and every instinct it owns is telling it to run, and there is nowhere left to run to. That's a scream. It gets into your spine. Pardon the mule was the only calm animal on the whole place, standing hock deep and looking at us with an expression I can only call disappointed, like we'd let this happen on purpose. We got the high ground horses moving first, the easy ones, the geldings and the two dry mares, hazing them up the slope toward the equipment shed on the ridge, which was the only structure I trusted the water not to reach. Thomas took them. He was good with them, better than me if I'm honest, and I watched him go up that hill in the dark with 5 panicked animals trusting his hands, and there was a half-second in the middle of the worst night of my life where I was just proud of him. It's strange what comes up in you when everything's on fire, or drowning, I suppose. Then it was Juniper. She was down. I want to be careful here because I've told this part wrong before, made it cleaner than it was. She wasn't down peaceful. She was down thrashing, half in the flooding paddock, and the water was already up over her belly, and she was trying to get her legs under her and couldn't, and I understood before I even reached the gate what was happening. She was foaling. Right there. In the water in the dark, a week early, with the river coming for her. Cesar reached her first. He was into that paddock and had his hands on her before I'd got the gate chain loose. I remember my fingers not working, that panic where your hands turn to somebody else's hands, and he was talking to her low in Spanish, the way he did, and she quit thrashing enough to let him near her head. She's early, I said. Stupid thing to say, he knew. She's early and she's scared and she's gonna kill herself or the foal if the water gets any higher, Cesar said, and it was maybe the longest sentence I ever heard out of him. We have to move her now or we lose both. Here is the first decision I want you to sit with, because at the time it didn't feel like a decision. It felt like a trap with no good door. You do not move a foaling mare. Every book, every old-timer, every hard lesson says you leave her be, you keep her calm, you let her body do the ancient thing it knows how to do. But you also do not leave her in rising water. Both of those things were true at once and they pointed opposite directions. And Cesar and I stood there in the storm for what felt like an hour and was probably 4 seconds, and then the water answered for us. It came up over her flanks in one cold surge and she screamed again and I said, "Move her. Move her now." You cannot carry a horse. People who don't know horses imagine you can. You can't. What you can do is get a mare who half trusts you to want the thing you want, and Cesar had that with Juniper, God knows how, and between the two of us hauling on a halter and him with a rope round her hindquarters and both of us just begging, we got her up. She came up out of that water like something being born itself, all noise and terror, and she lunged for the higher ground of the barn aisle and we let her have it. We ran alongside and steered and prayed. The barn floor was already an inch deep and rising, but it was concrete. It was level. It wasn't the pull of the river. We got her into the widest stall, the corner one, and she went down again almost immediately. And this time Cesar looked at me over her heaving side and I knew we weren't going to get her back up. This was it. This was where it was happening. "Get Marion," he said, "and get every dry towel and every dry thing on this place before it isn't dry anymore." I went. I remember the run back to the house through water that was now up past my ankles across ground that 3 hours ago had been dust. I remember thinking the words "the low pasture is a lake" and not being able to make them mean anything. I got Marion, who came without a question, who'd already gathered towels like she'd read my mind, and I got Thomas back down from the ridge. And by the time we were all 4 in that barn, the foal was already half into the world. And it was wrong. I knew it was wrong the second I saw it. It was small. Not small like a small foal, small like a mistake. Like the mare's body had run out of time and pushed out something only half finished. The legs were there, and the head was there, but the whole of it was a fraction of what it should have been, and it came out limp, not moving, into Cesar's hands in the flooding dark of that stall, and nobody said anything for a moment because there was nothing to say. Cesar cleared its nose, rubbed at it hard with a towel, harder than seemed kind, the way you have to. Nothing. He put his mouth near its muzzle and breathed. Marion had the lamp, we'd found another lamp, and in that light I watched a grown man breathe into a thing the size of a dog, and I watched Thomas turn away, because he was 19 and hadn't learned yet how to keep his face still when something dies, and I felt the whole night settle down onto my shoulders like a wet coat. Then it coughed. Small, wet, barely a sound at all under the rain hammering the tin roof. But it coughed, and it moved, one back leg kicking out at nothing, and Cesar sat back on his heels in the water and let out a breath that had his whole body in it. "Alive," he said, and then quieter, because Cesar never lied to me even when a lie was easier. "For now." Juniper the mare turned her head to look at what she'd made. "And I have kept cattle and horses my whole life, and I don't hold with people who put human feelings on animals. I think it's soft-headed and it does the animal a disservice. But I watched that mare look at that tiny broken foal, and I watched something go out of her. She'd fought the water. She'd fought us. She'd fought her own body. And she looked at that little thing and she just set it down somehow, all of it. Laid her head back in the wet straw, her sides going up and down too fast. "She's tired," Marion said. "She's more than tired," Cesar said. "I keep a ledger. Have my whole life, a habit off my father who kept one before me, weather and calvings and prices and rain, all in a green cloth book you can still buy at the feed store. And the perverse thing about a habit like that is it doesn't leave you when it ought to. Some cold clerk part of my brain, even standing in that barn, was already writing the entries. June 14. River, lost fence, low pasture. Juniper foaled early, foal small, unlikely. I hated that part of myself right then. But I've come to think that little clerk is what got me through some nights. When you can't feel a thing yet, sometimes you can still write it down. The filly, because it was a filly, we saw that when Cesar toweled her, could not stand. That's the thing you're waiting for, the thing that tells you whether you've got a chance. A healthy foal is up inside the hour, wobbling but up, hunting for the udder on legs that don't work yet but will. This one lay in the straw and tried. God, she tried. She'd get her front end braced and heave, and the back wouldn't follow, and she'd go down in a heap, and she'd rest a minute, and she'd try again. Over and over, this scrap of a creature, in a flooding barn, in the middle of a night that had already taken so much, just trying. "She won't make it," Thomas said, not cruel, broken. He said it the way you say a thing you're hopping someone will argue with. Nobody argued. By some hour past 4 the water in the barn had come up to nearly a foot, and we made the calls that floods make you make. Juniper we could not move again. She wouldn't have survived the trying, and there was nowhere higher to move her to that wasn't out in the open weather. So we did the only thing left. Cesar and Thomas built up a platform in the corner of the stall out of feed pallets and straw bales, got it up off the wet, and we lifted the filly onto it. She weighed nothing. I could hold her against my chest with one arm, and Juniper we banked up with bales as best we could and left her lying, because she would not rise. And we settled in to wait out the water and watch 2 animals we were fairly sure we were going to lose. That was when the men, Cesar, Thomas, and a neighbor named Ott, who'd come across on horseback at first light, threw water to his stirrups to see were we alive. That was when they got out the shovel. I told you about the shovel and the hook, and I meant it. Ott said it plain, standing in the barn door with the gray dawn behind him and the whole low country a brown sea. "Roy, that little one's suffering. Kindest thing you can do is not let her suffer through the day." He wasn't wrong. That's the thing I need you to hear. By every measure I'd learned in 51 years, Ott was right and Cesar half agreed, and even Thomas, who wanted her to live more than any of us, couldn't meet my eyes. A foal that can't stand can't nurse. A foal that can't nurse doesn't get the first milk, the stuff that's the whole difference between a live animal and a dead one, and without it you're just prolonging a small cruel thing. That was the arithmetic. Everybody in that barn knew the arithmetic. I stood over her. She'd stopped trying to stand worn out, and she was just lying on that pallet platform with her two big eyes half open, breathing, this small wet rack of ribs, and the rain finally easing off the roof for the first time in 9 hours so that the barn went quiet enough to hear her do it. In and out, faster than it should be. Every breath a little argument against the shovel. And I want to tell you I had some grand feeling. I didn't. I was exhausted past the bottom of myself. I'd lost 2 mares and a colt and half my fences and a barn I'd have to check the footings of and a foal that was already sold in my head. I did not have hope in me. Hope was gone. The water took it with the fence posts. What I had was smaller than hope, and it turned out to be tougher. I looked at that filly still breathing after everything, and I heard myself say, and I swear I hadn't decided to say it, not today. We're not doing it today. Ott looked at me, Roy. If she's still fighting, I'm not the one to quit for her, I said. She wants to try, we let her try. Sun's coming up, we give her the day. It was not wisdom. Looking back, it might have been the worst kind of selfishness, the kind dressed up as mercy, making a suffering animal wait so I didn't have to feel a thing yet. I've turned that over a lot of nights. I still don't know clean which it was. Cesar came and stood beside me. He looked down at her a long moment. Then he did a thing I didn't expect. He went and knelt by Juniper's head. The mare hadn't moved in hours, her breath gone shallow and rattling, and he put his hand flat on her neck, and he stayed there a while. When he came back, his face had changed. "The mare won't see noon," he said quietly. "Her heart's giving out. The foaling took too much." He paused. "So if you want that little one to have any chance at all, Roy, we've got maybe 2 hours to figure out how to get milk into a filly that can't stand up to take it. Because the one animal that could feed her," he tipped his head back toward Juniper, "is dying while we talk." The sun came up on all that water, gold across the top of a brown flood, the prettiest terrible thing I ever saw. Ott set the shovel down against the wall. Nobody picked it back up. And that filly, who didn't have a name, who had a dying mother and a 2% chance and a river all around her, took another breath. And another one, like she was counting them off just to spite us. We had 2 hours, and no idea in the world how to save her. Here's a thing about desperate men. They'll believe in a plan not because it's good, but because it's the only one in the room. The plan was Marion's, and it was thin as paper. If Juniper was dying and the filly couldn't stand to nurse, then the milk had to come to the filly by hand right now, before the mare's body quit, because that first milk, the yellow thick stuff, the colostrum, you can't buy it at the feed store and you can't fake it, and once it's gone from the mare, it's gone. So Marion knelt in the filth of that flooded stall with a clean bucket and warm hands, and she milked a dying horse. That is not a thing anyone should have to do, and I watched my wife do it without a word of complaint, tears cutting clean lines down her muddy face, murmuring good girl to a mare that could barely hear her. And Juniper let her. That's the part. That mare, at the very end of herself with her heart failing, stood, no, lay, and let a human being take from her the one thing she had left to give her foal. I don't put human feelings on animals. I've said that. But I was in the room, and I know what I saw, and I'll go to my grave believing that mare knew exactly what was being asked and gave it on purpose. We got maybe a cup. Cesar warmed it against his own body, and we fed it to the filly a little at a time off the end of a clean rag, and then a bottle Thomas rigged from a soda bottle and a length of surgical tube out of the vet kit, tilting her head, coaxing, most of it running down her chin and us scraping to save every drop. She was too weak to suck at first. Then somewhere in the middle of it she wasn't. Something switched on. She latched onto that tube and she pulled, and Cesar laughed an ugly relieved bark of a laugh and said, there she is. There's the fight." Juniper died a little after 9 that morning. Quiet in the end. Marion was with her. I was holding the filly. I heard my wife's breathing change, and I knew, and I didn't say anything, and neither did she, and we just kept doing the next thing because the next thing was the only place left to stand. I'm going to skip ahead now, past a lot of it, because the middle of a thing like that isn't really a story, it's just labor. Days of it. The water took 4 days to go all the way down and left everything painted brown and stinking, and there was a dead heifer in my machine shed, and the Hadleys lost everything, and the whole county spent that summer digging out. But in the corner of my barn, on a platform of pallets, a filly that everyone had measured for a grave was impossibly, stubbornly, on a schedule that ran her caretakers into the ground, refusing to die. Every 2 hours. That's what an orphan foal needs, around the clock, and we did it. We took shifts. Marion and I and Thomas and Cesar, and even out some nights, the same man who'd brought the shovel now driving out at 2 a.m. to take a feeding so the rest of us could sleep 3 hours in a row. We mixed milk replacer and fought her fevers and rubbed her legs and turned her so she wouldn't get sores, and for 11 days she still could not stand. 11 days. You have to understand how far outside the rules that is. A foal that can't stand in the first day is a dead foal. Every time, that's the arithmetic. And here was this one at day 8, day 9, day 10, still down, still eating, still looking up at whoever came into the stall with those 2 big eyes like she was waiting to hear the verdict. Thomas named her on day 6, which I'd told him not to do. You don't name what you might lose. It's an old rule and a coward's rule, and I know that now. He named her anyway. He called her June for the month and for the flood, and once he'd said it out loud in front of all of us, there was no unsaying it. And I saw on Cesar's face and Marion's face the same thing that was happening on mine, which was that we'd all just agreed without agreeing. To let this creature break our hearts if it came to that. Nomming her was a promise. It said we're in it now all the way, whatever the end is. She stood on day 12. I wasn't there for it, which I've always been sorry about. Marion was. She told me she'd gone in for the morning feeding and June had her legs, all 4, wobbling, splayed out like a card table about to fold. And she was up, actually up off the pallet and standing in the straw on the ground like a regular foal, shaking all over with the effort of it. And when Marion came in, June took 2 staggering steps toward her and fell down, and Marion said she sat down right there in the stall and cried like she hadn't cried when Juniper died. Like the tears had been waiting 12 days for permission. I came running when she called, and there was June down again but pushing back up and up again, and I stood in that doorway where Ott had stood with the shovel, and I watched a filly who wasn't supposed to see one sunrise stand up on her own 12 days after the flood. And I'll tell you the truth, I had to hold the doorframe. My legs went. 51 years old, and I had to hold the doorframe like an old man, and I didn't care who saw. That should be the end. If this were a made-up story, that's where it'd end, the triumph, the standing up, the tears. Roll it up neat. But I told you at the start nobody in this was a villain, and I also owe you that it doesn't end neat, because real things don't. June grew, but she grew wrong. She was always small, a full hand shorter than she should have been. That early birth cost her something she never got back. And one of her back legs never came in true. There was a turn to it, a slight paddle in her stride from all those days lying down, or maybe from the birth itself. No way to know. She'd never be a using horse. Delacroix, the buyer, came out that fall to see about the foal he'd been promised, and he looked at June a long while, and he was a decent man about it, but I could see the arithmetic running behind his eyes, the same arithmetic we'd all run over the shovel, and he shook my hand and said, "No hard feelings, Roy, but that's not a horse I can use." And he was right. She wasn't. So there's the ironic part, if you want to call it that, and I've had strangers hear this story and laugh at it, not unkindly. We near killed ourselves for weeks, 4 adults and a neighbor losing sleep and sanity, to save a horse that turned out to be worth, in strict dollars, less than the milk replacer we poured into her. The buyer walked. The money I'd built her into in my head was gone with the rest of the flood. By every measure in my father's green ledger, June was a loss. I kept her anyway. Of course I kept her. You don't need me to tell you that. Here's the thing I actually came to say. the thing that took me years to be able to put right. That flood took 2 good mares and a colt and my fences and a summer of my life, and it very nearly took a filly it had no business leaving alive. And for a long time I told this story as a triumph. The little one that beat the odds, proved us all wrong, all that. People like it told that way. It's clean. But that's not the true shape of it. The true shape is that June didn't prove anything by herself. She couldn't stand for 12 days. What proved everybody wrong wasn't one small horse's will to live, though God knows she had it. It was Cesar breathing into her muzzle in a flooding stall. It was Marion milking a dying mare with her hands shaking. It was Ott setting down the shovel he was right to bring, and then driving out at 2 in the morning for weeks to feed the very animal he'd have put down. It was my son nomming her against my orders because he refused to hedge his heart. We proved ourselves wrong. She just gave us the reason to. June's still here. She's old now, older than a small early-born filly had any right to get, gray coming in around her eyes, that back leg stiff in the cold. She's never carried a rider, never earned $1, never done one useful thing a ranch horse is supposed to do. She stands out in the near pasture, the same ground that was a lake that June, all those years ago. And when I come out in the mornings with the feed, she picks her head up and paddles over on that crooked leg, and she puts her nose against my chest the way she did when she was the size of a wet dog and I could hold her in one arm. I keep a ledger still, weather, calvings, prices, rain, and every June the 14th I write the same line, and it's the only entry in 50 years of that book that isn't a fact or a number. It just says, still here. The clerk in me hated her for being a loss. The rest of me knows she's the best thing that water ever left behind. Ott asked me once, years on, why I did it, why I kept her going when any sensible man would have let the day take her like he said, why I held that doorframe, why the line in the book. I've thought about it a lot. I still don't have the whole answer. But I think it's got something to do with the fact that we were all so tired that morning and so sure and so ready to be reasonable about a small dying thing, and she just kept breathing anyway. She didn't know she was supposed to quit. Nobody had told her the arithmetic. Sometimes I think that's the only thing that's ever saved any of us, not being strong, just not knowing yet that we're supposed to stop.